Miss Marple and the Widow's Five Daughters Secret. Good evening, dear listeners, and welcome to Cafe Tales. I'm Alie, your host, and it's so lovely to have you here again. Tell me, where are you listening from tonight, and how has your day been? I always enjoy reading your messages. Don't forget to subscribe for new cozy mysteries every day. Now let's begin our story. Chapter 1: Five Sisters Cottage. And Merry Me was, as always, a village that thrived on its conversations. In the small shops along the high street, in the tea rooms where ladies gathered for their afternoon refreshment, and particularly in the tidy parlors where neighbors called upon one another, the same topic had been circulating with pleasant regularity for some weeks now. The subject was Mrs. Emily Hale and her 5 daughters. It was not that there was anything improper about Mrs. Hale or her girls. Quite the contrary. Mrs. Hale was a widow of excellent reputation, capable and dignified, who had managed her household with admirable efficiency since the passing of Mr. Hale some 3 years prior. The 5 Miss Hales were well-brought-up young women, each with her own particular character and accomplishments. What made them such fertile ground for village interest was the sheer fact of their number and the rather romantic circumstances that surrounded them. Miss Marple, settling into her chair by the window with her knitting one early autumn afternoon, had heard a great deal about the Hales from various sources. Mrs. Price at the post office had been most informative about Ruth, the eldest, at 29, who was practical and sensible and ran the poultry with considerable success. Audrey, at 27, was generally acknowledged to be the prettiest of the 5, with a quick head for figures and a neat hand at accounts. Beatrice, aged 25, possessed a fine singing voice and was a valued member of the church choir. Clara, 23, had trained as a district nurse and was much appreciated for her gentle manner with the sick. And Diana, the youngest at 19, was the lively, impulsive one, always dashing about the village lanes on her bicycle. 5 daughters. It was rather like something from a fairy tale, Miss Marple reflected, though she was not given to fanciful thinking as a rule. The particular detail that had set tongues wagging most energetically was the matter of the dowries. Mr. Hale's will, it was understood, had made provision for each daughter to receive $500 upon her engagement, along with a share in a small meadow that had joined the cottage property. The meadow was known locally as 5 Sisters Field, which had a rather charming sound to it. Of course, Miss Marple thought, pausing in her knitting, $500 and a portion of land was not a fortune by any means, but it was a respectable amount, enough to give a young woman some independence, or to help a young couple establish themselves. The question that occupied St. Mary Me was, which of the Miss Hales would be the first to claim her portion? It was on a particularly fine September afternoon that Miss Marple had occasion to call at 5 Sisters Cottage herself. She had a surplus of eggs from her own hens, and Mrs. Hale had mentioned at church on Sunday that her layers had been rather off their production of late. The cottage stood at the edge of the village, a low rambling building hung with ivy that had turned a deep crimson with the approaching autumn. It had a comfortable, settled appearance, as though it had grown up from the earth rather than being built upon it. Miss Marple walked up the narrow path and knocked at the door. It was opened by Audrey, the second daughter, whose prettiness was immediately apparent. She had fair hair and clear gray eyes and a pleasant smile. "Miss Marple, how kind of you to call. I've brought some eggs, my dear. Your mother mentioned that your own birds were being difficult." "How thoughtful. Do come in. Mother is just finishing her correspondence, but she'll be delighted to see you." The interior of the cottage was neat and cheerful. Miss Marple was shown into a small sitting room where the afternoon light came through leaded windows, falling on chintz covers and polished furniture. There was an air of modest comfort about the place, of things being carefully maintained but not luxurious. Mrs. Hale appeared after a moment, a woman in her early 50s with a composed manner and intelligent eyes. "Miss Marple?" "This is most kind. Audrey, do put the kettle on." As Audrey left to prepare tea, Miss Marple noticed something on the hall table visible through the doorway. 5 bracelets lay arranged on a small tray, each identical to the others. They appeared to be made of coral, pretty things with a warm pink glow. Mrs. Hale followed her gaze and smiled. "A gift from my late husband," she said. "One for each of the girls. I keep them here as a reminder of their father." "How lovely," Miss Marple murmured. The tea was brought in, and the conversation turned to village matters. They had just begun discussing the harvest festival arrangements when there was a knock at the front door. Audrey went to answer it, and a moment later a man's voice could be heard in the hall. Mrs. Hale's expression became somewhat fixed, though her courtesy did not waver. "That will be Mr. Lomax," she said quietly. "The land agent. He's been most persistent about a matter of business." The man who entered the sitting room was perhaps 40. Well-dressed, with smooth manners and an air of professional confidence that bordered on self-satisfaction. He had dark hair parted into place and a smile that showed very white teeth. "Mrs. Hale, I do apologize for calling unannounced. I was passing and thought I might catch you at home." His eyes flicked to Miss Marple with polite curiosity. "Miss Marple, may I present Mr. Lionel Lomax?" "Mr. Lomax, Miss Marple is a neighbor." The introductions were made, and Mr. Lomax accepted Mrs. Hale's somewhat reluctant invitation to take a cup of tea. "I won't keep you long," he said, settling into a chair with the ease of a man accustomed to making himself comfortable in other people's homes. "I simply wanted to follow up on our last conversation about the bypass proposal. The surveying is nearly complete, and my principals are most eager to move forward with acquiring the necessary land. I've told you, Mr. Lomax, that Five Sisters Field is not for sale. But Mrs. Hale, you must consider the advantages. The compensation would be most generous, and there are certain complications regarding the title that might be better resolved through a straightforward sale." Mrs. Hale's lips thinned slightly. "The title is perfectly clear, Mr. Lomax." Of course. But these trust arrangements can be so tiresome, can't they? So many conditions to be met." At that moment, Beatrice entered, having returned from some errand in the village. She was a handsome young woman with strong features and a direct gaze. When she saw Mr. Lomax, her expression became decidedly cool. "Mr. Lomax," she said without warmth. "Miss Beatrice?" "Charming as always. Will we have the pleasure of hearing you sing at evensong this Sunday?" "If the choir director requires me, yes." There was a certain tension in the room now. Mr. Lomax seemed to enjoy it, his smile widening slightly as he glanced from mother to daughter. "I was just explaining to Mrs. Hale that complications can arise with property matters if not addressed promptly, but I'm sure such a sensible family as yours will see the wisdom of considering all options." He drank his tea in a leisurely fashion, made a few more remarks about the bypass and the advantages of progress, and finally took his leave with elaborate courtesy. After he had gone, there was a moment of silence. "That man," said Beatrice with feeling. "Now, Beatrice," said Mrs. Hale, but there was weariness in her voice. Miss Marple, gathering up her things to leave, paused as she passed through the hall. There was a faint smell in the air, something she could not quite place at first. It reminded her of the schoolroom, of paste pots and bookbinding. She glanced toward the back of the house where the scullery door stood ajar. The smell seemed to come from that direction, a flowery, slightly adhesive scent. "Thank you so much for the eggs, Miss Marple," said Audrey, appearing to show her out. "Not at all, my dear. One must help one's neighbors." As Miss Marple walked back down the path, she found herself thinking about the 5 bracelets on the tray. All identical, all waiting, and about Mr. Lomax with his smooth manner and his talk of clouded titles. St. Mary Me, she reflected, was never quite as peaceful as it appeared on the surface. Chapter 2. A surveyor at the Well Market Day in St. Mary Me fell on a Thursday, and it brought with it the usual bustle of activity. Farmers came in from the surrounding countryside with their produce. Housewives made their weekly purchases, and the high street took on a livelier character than it wore during the quieter days of the week. Miss Marple had made her own modest purchases and was walking back toward her cottage when she encountered Mrs. Price from the post office, who was hurrying along with an expression of considerable excitement. "Oh, Miss Marple, have you heard? There's been a dreadful accident at Miller's Well down on the lane past the old stile." "An accident? How distressing. I do hope no one has been seriously injured." "Injured? My dear Miss Marple, the poor man is dead. Mr. Lomax, the land agent. They found him just before dusk yesterday evening." Miss Marple felt a small shock of surprise, though she kept her composure. Mr. Lomax, whom she'd seen taking tea at Five Sisters' cottage only 3 days before, so smooth and confident in his manner. How very tragic. What happened? Mrs. Price drew closer, lowering her voice, though there was no one near enough to overhear. "Fell down the well, they say. The rope broke, and down he went onto the stones. Dr. Haydock was called, of course, but there was nothing to be done. His neck was broken from the fall." "How dreadful," Miss Marple murmured. "Was he alone?" "It seems so. His motor car was found nearby, parked at the verge. Inspector Slack has been down there this morning, poking about, but it appears to have been simply an accident." The rope snapped while Mr. Lomax was leaning over, trying to draw up the bucket, perhaps, or looking down into the well. Miss Marple continued on her way, but the news had disturbed her. Accidents did happen, of course. Wells were dangerous things, particularly the older ones, like Miller's Well, which dated back generations and was no longer in regular use. Still, something about it troubled her, though she could not have said exactly what. That afternoon, she happened to encounter Dr. Haydock as he was making his rounds. He was a bluff, practical man who had little patience for foolishness, but considerable skill in his profession. "Ah, Miss Marple, I suppose you've heard about our unfortunate visitor, Mr. Lomax." "Yes, Mrs. Price told me this morning. A terrible thing. Broken neck, instantaneous. He wouldn't have suffered if that's any comfort. Though I can't imagine what possessed the man to be leaning over that well in the first place. It's been disused for years. Was he alone at the time?" "Must have been. No signs of anyone else about, according to Slack. The rope simply gave way. Rotten, I suppose, though it didn't look particularly old." He shook his head. "Carelessness, that's what it was," leaning his weight on a rope without checking it first. Dr. Haydock went on his way, and Miss Marple found herself walking, almost without conscious decision, in the direction of the lane that led to Miller's Well. It was a quiet stretch of road, bordered by hedgerows and with open fields beyond. The well itself stood in a small yard, partially overgrown with grass and nettles. It was one of those deep stone wells common in the countryside, with a wooden frame above it, and a windlass from which the rope hung, or had hung. The rope now lay coiled on the ground where Inspector Slack had presumably left it after his investigation. Miss Marple approached slowly. There was no one about. The afternoon was still and peaceful, with only the sound of birds in the hedge. She bent down, her knees protesting slightly, and examined the rope. It had indeed broken roughly halfway along its length. The bucket lay on the stones at the bottom of the well. She could see it if she leaned over carefully, gripping the solid wooden frame. The break in the rope was remarkably clean, almost too clean, she thought. When rope rotted or frayed through age and wear, it came apart gradually, with loose fibers and an uneven separation. This break was sharp, almost as though it had been cut, though not quite. She picked up the end of the rope and looked at it more closely. The whipping at the end, the neat binding of thread that prevented the rope from unraveling appeared quite new. The thread was clean and tight, not weathered as one would expect from a rope that had hung outdoors for any length of time. Miss Marple pressed her fingers against the whipping just below where the rope had parted. There was something there, something that felt wrong, a slight give, a dampness that seemed to come from within the binding itself. When she pressed harder, a tiny trace of something whitish squeezed out from beneath the thread. Paste. She straightened up, her mind working. Why would there be paste under the whipping of a well rope? She walked slowly around the well yard, her sharp eyes noting details. The ground was hard-packed, but near the edge where the grass began, there was a single footprint preserved in a patch of softer earth. A woman's shoe, not a large one. The heel had left a clear impression, and there was something about the sole, a mark that suggested the instep had been darned, perhaps where the inner seam had once been cut or torn. Miss Marple stood there for some time thinking. Then she walked back to the village, her steps measured and thoughtful. That evening she sat in her parlor with her knitting, but her needles moved more slowly than usual. Her mind kept returning to that rope, to the too-clean break and the paste beneath the whipping, to the new thread binding old hemp, and to the footprint of a woman's shoe with a darned instep. The next morning brought Inspector Slack to her door. He was a man who didn't care much for what he called interference, and he had a particular weariness of Miss Marple, whose observations had on more than one occasion proved inconveniently accurate. "I understand you were down at Miller's Well yesterday afternoon," he said without preamble. "News does travel quickly in St. Mary Me," Miss Marple said mildly. "I was passing and thought I might see where the accident occurred." "Such a tragedy." "It was an accident, Miss Marple. Pure and simple. Man leaned on a rotten rope. Rope broke. Down he went. Nothing suspicious about it." "Oh, I'm sure you're quite right, Inspector," though I couldn't help noticing that the rope didn't look particularly rotten. The whipping was quite new, wasn't it? Slack's expression became more guarded. "Someone may have repaired it recently. That doesn't change the fact that it broke when weight was put on it." "Of course not," Miss Marple agreed, "though it does seem curious that a newly repaired rope would break so cleanly. And the paste under the whipping. I happened to feel it when I examined the rope end. It squeezed out just a little when pressed. Rather like bookbinder's paste, I thought. Or perhaps the sort one makes from flour and water." Inspector Slack looked as though he would have liked to dismiss this observation entirely. But something in Miss Marple's quiet certainty gave him pause. "I'll have another look at it," he said grudgingly. "But I'm telling you, Miss Marple, there's nothing to suggest this was anything other than an unfortunate accident." "I'm sure you know best, Inspector." After he had gone, Miss Marple sat down again with her knitting. But she was thinking about Five Sisters Cottage, about 5 daughters and their dowries, about a meadow called Five Sisters Field that Mr. Lomax had been so eager to acquire, and about the faint smell of paste she had noticed in the scullery on the afternoon of her visit, 3 days before Mr. Lomax met his death at Miller's Well. She thought, too, about the coral bracelets on the hall tray, 5 of them all identical, all waiting. A gift from their father, Mrs. Hale had said. But when Miss Marple closed her eyes and recalled that glimpse of the tray, she could see it quite clearly in her mind. There had been only 3 bracelets on the tray that afternoon, not 5. 2 were missing. Which 2 daughters, she wondered, had claimed their bracelets, and why? Chapter 3. Miss Marple Notices a Dampened Whipping. The morning after her conversation with Inspector Slack brought one of those soft gray days that early autumn sometimes provides, neither quite sunny nor actually raining, but with a dampness in the air that made everything feel slightly chill. Miss Marple had spent a restless night, her mind turning over the curious details of Mr. Lomax's death. She had known men to die from falls before, and wells were certainly hazardous structures. Yet something about the whole affair felt wrong, like a note played slightly off-key in an otherwise harmonious piece of music. After breakfast, she decided to call again at Five Sisters Cottage. She had a perfectly reasonable excuse. She needed to return the egg basket that Mrs. Hale had lent her, and it would be only courteous to inquire how the family was managing after the shocking news of Mr. Lomax's death. The walk to the cottage took her along the quiet lane, past gardens where late roses still bloomed and vegetable patches showed the orderly rows of autumn plantings. When she reached Five Sisters Cottage, she found Diana, the youngest daughter, in the yard drawing water from the pump. The girl looked up as Miss Marple approached, her face flushed from exertion. She was a pretty thing, lively and quick in her movements, with dark curls escaping from beneath a rather battered hat. "Miss Marple." "Good morning. Have you come to see Mother?" "If she's not too occupied, my dear. I've brought back the basket." Diana set down the bucket she had been filling and wiped her hands on her apron. "Do come in. Mother will be glad of the company. I think it's been rather a difficult few days." As Diana picked up the bucket to carry it inside, Miss Marple's attention was caught by the pump itself. The rope that worked the mechanism had been recently attended to. There was a whipping at one point along its length, bound with what appeared to be linen thread. The binding was neat and tight, the work of someone who knew how to make a proper repair. "Your pump rope has been mended, I see," Miss Marple remarked, keeping her tone casual. Diana glanced back at it. "Oh, yes. Mother's always mending things about the place. Can't afford to replace everything that wears out, so we make do." "That whipping was done just the other day, I believe." Miss Marple moved closer to examine it as though merely expressing polite interest. The thread was clean and new, wrapped firmly around the rope. But when she touched it lightly with one finger, she felt something beneath the surface, a very slight ridge that suggested something had been placed under the thread before it was wound. Paper, perhaps, or thin fabric. It was the same technique she had observed on the well rope where Mr. Lomax had died. They went inside, and Miss Marple was shown through to the sitting room where Mrs. Hale sat with some mending in her lap. The widow looked tired. There were shadows beneath her eyes that had not been there on Miss Marple's previous visit. "Miss Marple, how kind of you to call. Diana, do ask Audrey to make some tea." "I won't stay long," Miss Marple assured her. "I know this must be a trying time. The news about Mr. Lomax was such a shock." Mrs. Hale's hand stilled on her mending. "Yes, a dreadful accident. One hears of such things, of course, but one never expects them to happen to someone one actually knows." "Had you known him long?" "Only these past few months since he began calling about the bypass proposal. He was most persistent in his attentions." There was something in her tone, a tightness that suggested those attentions had not been entirely welcome. Audrey appeared with the tea tray, her movements as neat and precise as everything else about her. She poured with a steady hand, passed the cups with quiet efficiency. "I understand the police believe it was simply an accident. The rope breaking. You know." "So Inspector Slack told us when he called yesterday," said Mrs. Hale. "Apparently, these old ropes can be quite treacherous." Miss Marple sipped her tea thoughtfully. Through the open door to the hall, she could see partway down the passage toward the back of the house. The scullery door was visible from this angle, and it stood slightly ajar. "I wonder if I might trouble you for a glass of water," she said. "The tea is lovely, but I find I'm rather thirsty this morning." "Of course," said Audrey, rising at once. "I'll fetch you one." "Oh, don't trouble yourself, my dear. If you'll just point me toward the kitchen, I can help myself." There was the briefest hesitation, so brief that anyone less observant than Miss Marple might have missed it entirely. Then Mrs. Hale smiled, through the passage and to the left. "The scullery is just beyond if you need it." Miss Marple made her way slowly down the passage. The kitchen was tidy, with copper pans hanging from hooks and a scrubbed wooden table. Beyond it, the scullery door stood open. She stepped inside. It was a small room, cool and dim, with a stone floor and shelves along one wall. On the shelves were the usual items one would expect: jars of preserves, pickled onions, a crock of butter, various tins and packages, and on the lower shelf, a pot of paste. Miss Marple bent down, her knees protesting. The paste pot was earthenware with a wide mouth. Inside was a grayish mixture that had the look of flour and water, perhaps with a touch of glue added for strength, the sort of paste used for mending books or sticking labels or any number of household purposes. Stuck to the rim of the pot, dried stiff, was a piece of linen thread. Miss Marple straightened up slowly. On a shelf nearby was a small wooden box, the sort that might hold sewing supplies. She opened it carefully. Inside were several spools of thread, needles, and notably a larger spool of the same linen thread that she had seen on the pump rope, and that now clung to the paste pot. She closed the box and returned to the sitting room with her glass of water. "Thank you so much," she said, settling back into her chair. "What a well-ordered household you keep, Mrs. Hale. Everything in its place." "One must make do," said Mrs. Hale, echoing Diana's earlier words. "When one has limited means, good management becomes essential." "Indeed. I quite admire the way you've trained your daughters. They all seem so capable, even the mending. I noticed your pump rope has been beautifully repaired." "Yes, I did that myself just recently. The rope was beginning to fray, and one can't be too careful with such things." Audrey had returned and was sitting quietly with her hands folded in her lap. She looked at her mother as Mrs. Hale spoke, and something passed between them, a communication too subtle for words. "One must make things hold," Mrs. Hale continued, her voice serene. She reached out and touched Miss Marple's arm briefly, a gesture that seemed both friendly and somehow significant. "That's the important thing, Miss Marple. Making things hold together." Miss Marple finished her tea and took her leave shortly afterward. As she walked back to the village, she thought about paste and thread and ropes that were made to hold, but only until they were dampened. She thought about the scullery with its pot of paste and its spool of linen thread, about Mrs. Hale's calm assertion that she had repaired the pump rope herself, and she thought about the well rope that had killed Mr. Lomax, with its too clean break and its trace of paste beneath the whipping. Someone in that house knew how to make a rope appear sound when it was not. Someone knew how to bind it so carefully that it would hold under light use, but give way when subjected to real weight, particularly when moisture had softened the hidden paste that held the deception together. The question was not whether the rope had been deliberately sabotaged. Miss Marple was increasingly certain that it had been. The question was, which of the 5 daughters, or their capable mother, had possessed both the skill and the motive to arrange Mr. Lomax's fall? By the time Miss Marple reached her own cottage, the gray morning had given way to a light drizzle. She stood at her window, watching the rain dampen the garden, and thought about how water changed things. Paste that was hard when dry became soft and slippery when wet. Rope that seemed secure could fail when moisture worked its way into hidden weaknesses. And secrets, like paste and rope, had a way of coming apart when enough pressure was applied. Chapter 4. Dowries. Bracelets and a field Miss Marple had been invited to tea at Gossington Hall, the residence of her old friend, Mrs. Bantry. It was an invitation she accepted with pleasure, for Dolly Bantry was both entertaining company and remarkably well informed about the affairs of the neighborhood. The drawing-room at Gossington was comfortable and elegant, with long windows overlooking the gardens. Mrs. Bantry, a handsome woman with iron-gray hair and shrewd eyes, poured tea from a Georgian silver service and regarded her guest with interest. "I've been dying to have a proper chat with you. Jane, this business with Mr. Lomax has set the whole county talking. Inspector Slack came round yesterday asking the most peculiar questions about who might have seen what and when. Did he indeed? Miss Marple accepted her cup with a murmur of thanks. I suppose he must be thorough, even when an accident appears straightforward. Accident? Mrs. Bantry gave a short laugh. My dear Jane, I've known you far too long to believe you think it was an accident. You've got that look about you, the one you always wear when something doesn't add up properly. Miss Marple smiled faintly. There was no point in dissembling with Dolly, who had a gift for reading people that was nearly as acute as her own. Well, there are one or two curious features, she admitted, though I may be seeing complications where none exist. Tell me, what do you know about Mrs. Hale and her daughters? Mrs. Bantry settled back in her chair, clearly delighted to have her suspicions confirmed. Emmeline Hale, a very capable woman, I've always thought. She's managed that household admirably since poor George Hale died. Heart trouble, it was quite sudden. He was a solicitor's clerk in Market Basing. Respectable, but not wealthy. Left his widow and 5 girls to make their way as best they could. And the dowries? Ah, you've heard about those? Yes. George made provision in his will. $500 to each daughter upon her engagement. And a share in 5 sisters' field. Rather romantic? Really, though I suspect the practicalities are more complex than they first appear. Miss Marple sipped her tea thoughtfully. In what way complex? Mrs. Bantry leaned forward, warming to her subject. The field is held in trust, you see. I had it from Colonel Melchett, who knows about these legal matters. The trust terms are rather particular. The field doesn't vest fully in the daughters until at least 2 of them are properly engaged by Michaelmas of this year. If that condition isn't met, the property reverts to George Hale's estate, which means it would go to some distant cousin or other. Michaelmas, Miss Marple repeated. That's less than a fortnight away. Precisely. And therein lies the difficulty. None of the girls has yet posted banns, though there have been understandings of a sort. Ruth, the eldest, has been walking out with Tom Barkley, the cowman at Enderby Farm. Solid fellow, nothing much in the way of prospects, but honest and hard-working. And Beatrice has an understanding with young Philip Crane, the choirmaster's son. He's studying to be a schoolmaster. But no formal engagements? Not yet. And Mr. Lomax, it seems, had a particular interest in acquiring that field. Something to do with the proposed bypass. If it went through 5 Sisters Field, his employers would save a considerable sum in construction costs. Lomax was pressing Mrs. Hale quite aggressively. I understand. Miss Marple thought about the coral bracelets on the hall tray. 3 when she had visited, though Mrs. Hale had said there were 5, 1 for each daughter. Mrs. Bantry, what can you tell me about the bracelets? Bracelets? Dolly looked momentarily puzzled. Then her face cleared. Oh, you mean the coral ones. George gave them to the girls before he died, 1 each. Rather sweet, really. They were to mark each daughter's portion being claimed. When a girl became engaged, she would take her bracelet from the tray and wear it as a symbol of her father's blessing and her inheritance. I see. And have any of the daughters claimed theirs? Mrs. Bantry considered. Now that you mention it, I believe Ruth was wearing hers at church last Sunday. And I think I saw Beatrice with one at the choir rehearsal. So, 2 have been claimed, which would make sense if those 2 have understandings, even if not formal engagements. 2 bracelets claimed, Miss Marple thought. 2 daughters with understandings, and Michaelmas fast approaching, when the trust would either vest or revert. What about the other 3 daughters? She asked. Audrey is something of an enigma, very pretty girl, excellent at figures. She keeps the household accounts and manages things beautifully. I've heard more than one young man express interest, but she's never seemed inclined to encourage anyone. Mr. Lomax was rather persistent in his attentions toward her, though whether it was genuine interest or simply a way of getting close to the family and their property, one can't say. And Clara, the district nurse? Sweet girl, very gentle and kind. She's devoted to her work, out at all hours attending to the sick. I don't think she has time for courting, though she's certainly attractive enough. And Diana, the youngest? Mrs. Bantry laughed. Diana is 19 and full of life. Half the young men in market basing are sweet on her, I should think. She's always dashing about on that bicycle of hers, getting into scrapes. Reminds me of what I was like at that age, though I hate to admit it. But she's far too young to be thinking seriously of marriage yet. Miss Marple absorbed all this information, filing it away in the orderly compartments of her mind. You said Mr. Lomax was pressing Mrs. Hale about the field. Was there any particular urgency to his interest? Oh, yes. The bypass route hasn't been finalized yet. You see, if the surveyors recommend going through Five Sisters Field, which seems likely given the terrain, then Lomax's firm would need to secure the property quickly. But if the field vests in the daughters and they're disinclined to sell, well, that rather puts a spoke in the wheel. So Mr. Lomax had reason to want the trust to fail. Exactly. And there were whispers, mind you, only whispers, that he had hinted to Audrey that if the family were willing to be, shall we say, accommodating about the sale, there might be additional considerations involved. What sort of considerations? Mrs. Bantry looked uncomfortable. I shouldn't like to spread gossip, Jane, but it was suggested that Mr. Lomax had offered Audrey some sort of advance on the dowries, perhaps even something extra, if she could persuade her mother and sisters to let the trust lapse and sell the field to his employers. Miss Marple's face remained serene, but her eyes were very sharp. A bribe, in effect, if you want to put it that way. Yes, though nothing could be proved, of course. It was all hints and suggestions, the sort of thing a clever man like Lomax would know how to convey without ever saying anything directly actionable. They talked of other matters for a while, but Miss Marple's mind kept returning to Five Sisters Cottage and its inhabitants. 5 daughters, 5 coral bracelets, and a meadow called Five Sisters Field, 2 daughters with understandings, 2 bracelets claimed, and Michaelmas less than a fortnight away, and Mr. Lomax, smooth and confident, pressing his suit with Audrey while simultaneously threatening the family's inheritance. As she walked home through the village in the late afternoon, Miss Marple thought about families and obligations, about fathers who tried to provide for their daughters and mothers who tried to protect them. She thought about dowries and trust deeds and legal complications, about roads that needed to be built and fields that stood in their way. And she thought about a man who had been too pressing, too confident in his ability to manipulate a family of women he clearly thought were vulnerable, a man who had died at Miller's Well, killed by a rope that appeared sound but was not, that held firm when dry, but failed when dampened. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to arrange themselves in Miss Marple's mind, though the picture they formed was not yet complete. But she was beginning to see its outlines, and what she saw troubled her deeply. Chapter 5. A Sketch Plan with 2 Hands. Inspector. Slack was not a man who welcomed assistance in his investigations, particularly not from elderly ladies who lived quietly in the village and occupied themselves with knitting and gardening. However, he had learned through bitter experience that Miss Marple possessed an uncanny ability to notice details that others overlooked. It was therefore with mixed feelings that he found himself, 2 days after his last visit, once again standing on her doorstep. "Good morning, Inspector." "What a pleasant surprise. Do come in." Slack followed her into the neat sitting room, holding a manila envelope rather awkwardly. "I've been going over the Lomax business again," he said without preamble. "That paste you mentioned under the whipping, I had another look at the rope." Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily. "You were right. There's paste there, and what looks like paper or thin fabric underneath the thread binding. Dr. Haydock says the paste is the sort made from flour and water, possibly with a bit of glue added. How interesting! Slack shifted his weight from one foot to the other. The thing is, Miss Marple, I'm not entirely satisfied this was a simple accident. A rope doesn't just happen to have paste and paper underneath unless someone put it there deliberately. That would seem logical. Yes. So, I've been looking into Mr. Lomax's movements before he died. His motor car was found near the well, as you know. Inside it were various papers relating to his surveying work. He drew a folded document from the envelope and spread it on the table before her. This is a sketch plan of the area around Five Sisters Field. Lomax had been surveying for the bypass route. I thought you might like to see it. Miss Marple set down her knitting and leaned forward to examine the document. It was drawn on good quality paper, showing the field boundaries, lanes, and various landmarks in neat blue ink. The draftsmanship was precise and professional, but there was something else. Overlaying the neat blue lines were penciled annotations written in a different hand entirely. Where the blue ink was firm and masculine, the pencil notes were lighter, rounder, more feminine in character. Wellhead, one note read, with a small arrow pointing to a spot on the lane. Old style, said another, marking a break in the hedgerow. Hedge cut, a third indicated, showing where vegetation had been trimmed back. Miss Marple studied the penciled writing carefully. The letters were formed with an interesting characteristic. The letter D, wherever it appeared, had a distinctly flat top rather than the usual curved ascender. It was the sort of detail that spoke of careful schooling. Perhaps someone who had been taught calligraphy or had spent time copying manuscript. 2 different hands, she murmured. The plan itself in ink and these penciled additions by someone else. That's what I thought, said Slack. The question is, who added the pencil notes and why? May I see what else was in the motor car? Slack hesitated, then drew out another slip of paper, smaller, torn from a notebook. On it were written some figures, $500 to Berkshire 1000, and below that, in the same penciled hand as the notes on the plan, bracelets to Trey. Miss Marple absorbed this silently. $500 to, the amount of 2 dowries, and a reminder about bracelets being returned to the tray. Inspector, I wonder if I might see the plan again for just a moment. She examined it once more, paying particular attention to the formation of the letters. That flat-topped D appeared several times. She had seen that same characteristic recently. She was certain of it. Where did you find these papers? The plan was on the passenger seat. The smaller note was in the ashtray, crumpled up as though someone had discarded it. Was there anything else of interest? Some business correspondence? Nothing relevant. A road map. Half a packet of cigarettes. He paused. There was one other thing, though I don't know if it means anything. When we examined the ground near the well, we found some marks that suggested someone had been standing there, watching. Perhaps, but the prints weren't clear enough to make anything of them. After Inspector Slack had taken his leave, promising to inform her if anything further came to light, Miss Marple sat quietly with the image of that sketch plan fixed in her mind. The flat-topped D was distinctive. She had seen it somewhere recently, she was certain. Where had it been? She closed her eyes, letting her memory work. Five Sisters Cottage, the sitting room, the passage, the daughters coming and going. And then it came to her. The church last Sunday. She had been sitting behind the choir and had glanced down at the hymn book that Beatrice Hale was holding. The girl had penciled her own notes in the margin, reminders about where to breathe, where the tempo changed. And every D had that same flat top, the mark of someone taught to write clearly and beautifully, perhaps for the benefit of a choir director reading over her shoulder. Beatrice had annotated Lomax's sketch plan. But why? And when? Had Lomax shown her the plan, perhaps consulting her about local landmarks, or had she seen it by some other means? Miss Marple thought about Beatrice, proud and quick-tempered, a girl who sang in the choir and who had an understanding, however informal, with the choir master's son, a girl who would want her dowry, who would need the trust to vest so that she could claim her 500 and her share of the field, a girl who had reason to dislike Mr. Lomax, who had been pressing her family so aggressively about selling the property. But had she reason enough to kill him? The note about the bracelets troubled Miss Marple. Bracelets to tray suggested that someone had been thinking about returning the coral bracelets, making it appear that no engagements were imminent, that the trust might fail. Why would anyone want to create that impression? Unless the purpose was to deceive Mr. Lomax into thinking the family was weakening, that they might be persuaded to sell after all. 500 x 2, 1,000, 2 dowries. 2 engagements needed to secure the trust before Michaelmas. Someone had been calculating, working out the mathematics of inheritance and obligation. Someone had been thinking very carefully about bracelets and dowries and what needed to happen before the deadline. Miss Marple rose and went to her window, looking out over the quiet village street. The afternoon was drawing in, and lamplighters would soon be making their rounds. Somewhere in St. Mary Me, in a low cottage hung with ivy, 5 daughters were living their lives under the shadow of their father's will and a land agent's manipulation. 2 of them wore coral bracelets, marking their portions as claimed. 3 did not, and one of those 5 daughters, or perhaps their capable mother, had prepared a rope with paste and paper and careful whipping, knowing that when Mr. Lomax leaned his weight upon it at the well, it would fail. The penciled notes on the plan suggested that someone had been there before Lomax died, had marked the landmarks, had perhaps even planned the precise spot where the accident would occur, someone who wrote with flat-topped Ds, and who thought in terms of choir rehearsals and careful annotation. Miss Marple returned to her chair and took up her knitting once more. The pattern was a complex one, requiring concentration, but her fingers moved with practiced ease. She was beginning to see how it had been done, the preparation of the rope, the luring of Lomax to the well, the careful timing, but she did not yet see why that particular daughter had chosen to act, or whether she had acted alone. Those answers would require more careful observation, and perhaps a conversation or two with the residents of Five Sisters Cottage. Chapter 6. Alibis by Kettle, Choir, and Cart Inspector Slack had done his duty thoroughly, as Miss Marple learned when she encountered him outside the post office 3 days later. He looked tired and somewhat irritable, which suggested that his investigation had not yielded the clear results he had hoped for. "Have you established when Mr. Lomax died?" Miss Marple inquired after the usual pleasantries had been exchanged. "Dr. Haydock places it between 5 and 6 on Thursday evening, probably closer to 6, given the degree of cooling and so forth. Medical details, you know. And have you been able to determine where everyone was at that time?" Slack gave her a sharp look but seemed to decide that sharing the information might prompt some useful observation from her. "As a matter of fact, I have." "Would you care to hear it?" "If you think it might be helpful, Inspector." They walked slowly along the high street as Slack consulted his notebook. Mrs. Hale herself was visiting with the Canon's wife, Mrs. Clement. They were discussing arrangements for the Harvest Festival. Mrs. Clement confirms that Mrs. Hale arrived at approximately 5 and remained until 5 minutes to 6. She then walked home directly, which would have taken about 10 minutes. So, Mrs. Hale has a solid alibi for most of the relevant period. Yes. Now, the daughters. He flipped a page. Ruth Hale, the eldest, was loading eggs into Tom Barkley's cart between 20 minutes to 6 and 6 o'clock. Barkley confirms this. He was taking a load to market basing and stopped to collect the eggs on his way. Several people saw them together at the cart. Miss Marple nodded. Ruth, with her practical nature and her understanding with the honest cowman, seemed an unlikely candidate for elaborate deception. Beatrice Hale was at choir rehearsal. They were practicing the Magnificat for Sunday service. The rehearsal ran from 5 until 6. The choir director and 7 other members confirm her presence throughout. That's very thorough. Clara Hale was on her district rounds. She called at old Mrs. Yates's cottage at 5:45. Mrs. Yates signed the district nurse logbook at that time, and Clara remained with her until approximately 6:10, attending to a bandage that needed changing. 3 of the 5 daughters accounted for, Miss Marple thought. That leaves Audrey and Diana. Diana Hale told me she went for a bicycle ride along the lane. She says she spoke to no one and simply needed some air. She left the cottage at about 20 minutes to 6 and returned around 4. 4? 6, typo in my notes. Around 6? No witnesses? None that I've been able to find. However, a farm boy, young Ted Hoskins, says he saw a girl in a duck egg blue cardigan near the old ice house stile at about 5 minutes past 6. He didn't see her face clearly, as she was some distance away, but he noticed the cardigan because his sister has worn the same color. And does Diana own such a cardigan? She does, but so does Beatrice, apparently. Mrs. Hale confirmed that both girls have cardigans of that shade. They were purchased at the same time from a shop in Market Basing. How convenient, Miss Marple thought, or how inconvenient, depending on one's perspective. And Audrey? Audrey Hale was at home. She says she boiled the kettle and made tea, which she sent to her mother upon Mrs. Hale's return. She also says she was working on the household accounts, settling the petty cash from market day. Was anyone with her to confirm this? No. The other sisters were all out, as I've described, and Mrs. Hale was at the vicarage. Audrey was alone at the cottage from approximately 5 until her mother returned just after 6. I see. They had reached the corner where the lane turned toward Five Sisters' cottage. Inspector Slack paused, his expression troubled. The difficulty is this, Miss Marple. If we're talking about murder, and I'm increasingly inclined to think we are, then we need to consider who had the opportunity. Mrs. Hale, Ruth, Beatrice, and Clara all have witnesses placing them elsewhere at the crucial time. That leaves Diana and Audrey, both of whom had opportunity. Exactly. Diana admits to being out on her bicycle alone during the relevant period. She could have gone to Miller's well, and Audrey was alone at the cottage, but the well is only a 10-minute walk away. She could have slipped out, done the deed, and returned to her accounts with no one the wiser. Miss Marple considered this carefully. You mentioned that a girl in a duck egg blue cardigan was seen near the ice house stile. Where is that in relation to the well? About 200 yards south. Someone walking from the stile to the well would take perhaps 5 minutes. And someone watching from the stile would have a clear view of the wellhead. Slack looked at her with renewed interest. As a matter of fact, yes, there's a gap in the hedgerow there. You could see the wellhead quite clearly from that position. So the girl in the blue cardigan might have been watching, rather than participating. That's one interpretation. Or she might have been fleeing the scene. Miss Marple was silent for a moment, thinking about 2 sisters who both owned blue cardigans, about Diana, impulsive and lively, who might run to confront trouble directly, and about Audrey, neat and precise, who kept careful accounts and thought in terms of columns that must balance. Inspector, when you spoke with the daughters, did you happen to notice what they were wearing? Wearing? Slack looked puzzled. I can't say I paid particular attention. Why? Shoes, Inspector. Did you notice their shoes? Well, now that you mention it, Diana's had been recently mended. I noticed because the stitching on one was quite visible, where the instep had been darned. Mrs. Hale mentioned that Diana had torn the inner seam weeks ago. catching it on a fence, and had mended it herself rather than pay for new ones. The darned instep. Miss Marple remembered the footprint near the well, the small heel with the repaired seam, clearly visible in the soft earth, so Diana was at the well at some point. It would seem so. Yes, though she denies it. They parted shortly after, Slack returning to his duties and Miss Marple continuing her walk. But her mind was working furiously, arranging and rearranging the pieces of information. Diana had been at the well. Her distinctive footprint proved it. Yet she claimed to have spoken to no one and to have simply taken a ride along the lane. Why lie, unless she had something to hide? But Beatrice had annotated Lomax's sketch plan. Her characteristic handwriting gave her away. Had she and Diana been working together? Had one prepared the rope while the other lured Lomax to the well? Or was it Audrey, alone at home with her account books and her careful mind, who had arranged everything? Audrey, whom Lomax had attempted to bribe, who understood better than anyone the financial implications of the trust and the approaching deadline. The alibis were like a puzzle, each piece fitting neatly, but the overall picture remaining frustratingly unclear. Ruth, with her eggs in Tom's cart, Beatrice with her choir rehearsal and the Magnificat, Clara with her district rounds, and old Mrs. Yates's bandage, Mrs. Hale, with Canon Clement's wife and harvest festival plans, all solid, all confirmed by witnesses, leaving. Only Diana, who admitted to being out but claimed innocence, and Audrey, who had been alone with her kettle and her ledgers. Miss Marple reached her cottage and went inside. Her knitting awaited her in its accustomed basket. But before she sat down, she went to her small writing desk and drew out a sheet of paper. On it, she began to make notes in her neat, careful hand, times and places, witnesses and absences, the rope with its paste and whipping, the sketch plan with its two different hands, the footprint with the darned instep, the girl in the duck-egg blue cardigan near the ice house stile, and at the bottom of the page she wrote, "Who benefits? Who had means? Who had knowledge?" The answer, she suspected, involved all 5 daughters and their capable mother, but which one had tied the knot, so to speak, and sent Mr. Lomax to his death? That was the question that still required answering. Chapter 7. The Linen Thread in the Paste Pot. The village shop kept by Mr. Pratt was one of those establishments that seemed to stock everything, from bootlaces to biscuits, from writing paper to wax candles. It was also inevitably a clearinghouse for village information, as Mr. Pratt had an excellent memory for who purchased what and when. Miss Marple had a perfectly legitimate reason for calling there. She needed some embroidery silk, but she also hoped that Mr. Pratt might be able to provide certain details that would clarify the picture forming in her mind. The shop bell tinkled as she entered, and Mr. Pratt looked up from behind his counter with his usual cheerful expression. "Good morning, Miss Marple. What can I do for you today?" "Some embroidery silk, if you please. The shade I need is rather specific, a soft rose color for a cushion cover I'm working on." While Mr. Pratt assembled various skeins for her inspection, Miss Marple remarked in a casual tone, "I understand Mrs. Hale does a great deal of mending at Five Sisters Cottage. She keeps such a well-ordered household." "That she does, Miss Marple. Very particular about having the right materials for the job. Just last week, or perhaps it was the week before, she was in here purchasing linen thread and bookbinder's paste." "Bookbinder's paste? How unusual." "She said it was for mending. Apparently it's excellent for repairs where you need something to hold firm, much better than ordinary glue for certain applications." Miss Marple selected her embroidery silk and watched as Mr. Pratt wrapped it. "I believe several of the Miss Hales are also customers of yours." "Oh, yes, indeed. Audrey comes in regularly for household supplies." Let me think. She purchased some glue powder just recently. For the account ledgers, she said. Needs to repair the bindings now and again. And the younger girls, Diana is in and out all the time. Lively young thing. Always wanting hairpins or ribbons or some such. Last time she was here, she bought a blue ribbon and a packet of hairpins. Beatrice comes less often, usually only when she needs something for the church or the choir. And Clara, the district nurse, she orders her medical supplies through Dr. Haydock mostly, though she does buy soap and such here when she needs it. Miss Marple thanked Mr. Pratt and departed with her embroidery silk. The information confirmed what she had suspected. Mrs. Hale had purchased the materials needed to prepare the rope, linen thread and bookbinder's paste. But Audrey had bought glue powder as well, which could be mixed with flour and water to create a similar substance. The question remained, who had actually prepared the rope? That afternoon, she received an unexpected visit from Inspector Slack. He looked grimmer than usual and carried with him a small evidence bag. "I've had the rope fragment analyzed more thoroughly," he said without preamble. "The laboratory confirms the presence of paste made from flour, water, and glue. Also traces of egg white, which apparently was added to make the paste stiffen more quickly." "How very interesting. There's more. The inner strands of the rope show clear marks of having been sawn through, not frayed naturally. Someone cut the rope nearly halfway through, then covered the cut with a paper sleeve and whipped over it with linen thread. The paste held everything together until moisture from the well weakened it." He drew a small fragment from the evidence bag. "This was found wedged between the stones at the well. It's a flake of dried paste with the impression of linen weave clearly visible. And here you can see a slight discoloration that the laboratory identifies as egg white." Miss Marple examined it carefully through her spectacles. The evidence was damning. Someone had gone to considerable trouble to create a rope that would appear sound, but would fail at a crucial moment. "It's a remarkably clever method," she observed. "The sort of thing that requires both patience and skill. The whipping must be done neatly, or it would be immediately obvious that something was wrong, and the timing must be judged precisely, knowing when the paste would be dry enough to hold yet still vulnerable to dampness." Exactly. This wasn't done in haste or in anger. It was planned carefully, perhaps over several days. "Have you learned anything more about Mr. Lomax's activities before his death?" Slack consulted his notebook. He spent Thursday afternoon surveying along the proposed bypass route. Several people saw him taking measurements and making notes. He was last seen alive at approximately 4:45, speaking with the blacksmith near the forge. He said he was going to have a final look at the well site before the light failed. Did he say why? Something about checking the water table. The bypass construction would need to account for underground water sources. So Lomax had gone to Miller's well deliberately, Miss Marple thought. But had he gone of his own accord, or had someone suggested it to him? "Inspector, was there any indication that Mr. Lomax expected to meet someone there?" Slack frowned. "Not that we've discovered, though he did mention to the blacksmith that he had some business to conclude regarding Five Sisters Field. He seemed confident that matters would soon be resolved in his favor." After Slack departed, Miss Marple sat quietly with her thoughts. The paste with its traces of egg white suggested someone with access to a kitchen, someone who understood how to mix substances to achieve the desired consistency and drying time. The linen thread pointed to someone who did fine mending or sewing. All of the Hale women would have had such knowledge. In a household run on limited means, every woman would know how to make paste for various purposes, how to mend and repair to extend the life of belongings. But the preparation of the rope required more than just domestic skill. It required knowledge of how rope behaved under stress, how whipping could disguise a weakness, how moisture would affect paste and paper. It was, Miss Marple reflected, the sort of trick that a farmer might use to make damaged equipment appear sound for long enough to sell it. A dishonest practice, but one that showed considerable understanding of materials and their properties. Where would someone in the Hale household have learned such a thing? She thought about Mrs. Hale, a solicitor's clerk's widow who had managed a household and 5 daughters with admirable capability. About Ruth, who ran the poultry and would understand the rural world and its sometimes questionable practices. About the other daughters, with their various accomplishments and areas of knowledge. The paste pot in the scullery had shown signs of recent use, the middle portion scooped out and the top refreshed to hide the loss. Someone had taken paste from that pot for a specific purpose, then tried to conceal the fact. The linen thread with its end dried stiff over the rim told its own story. Someone had dipped thread into paste, used it for whipping, and left the remainder to dry in the pot. Miss Marple rose and fetched her knitting, but her fingers moved slowly and thoughtfully. The mechanics of the murder were becoming clear. What remained obscure was the precise sequence of events, and most importantly, which member of the household had possessed both the skill to prepare the rope and the cold determination to use it. For this was not a crime of passion or sudden impulse. This was calculated murder, planned with care and executed with precision. Someone at Five Sisters Cottage had decided that Mr. Lomax must die, and had made it happen with the patience of a spider spinning a web. Chapter 8. A Bedroom Window and a Locked Scullery. Miss Marple had been invited to Five Sisters Cottage once more, this time by Clara, the gentle district nurse, who had called to ask if Miss Marple might donate some items for a charity jumble sale benefiting the village hospital. It was, Miss Marple reflected as she walked along the familiar path, a providential opportunity to observe the household more closely. The afternoon was fine, with autumn sunshine gilding the ivy that clung to the cottage walls. Clara met her at the door, her sweet face showing the fatigue of someone who kept irregular hours attending to the sick. "Miss Marple, how kind of you to come. Mother is resting upstairs. She's had rather a trying week, but please do come in and have some tea. I'll show you the sort of items we're hoping to collect." The sitting room was as neat as ever, though there was a slight air of strain about the place that had not been there on Miss Marple's first visit. Audrey brought the tea tray, her movements as precise as always, but her face was pale, and there were shadows beneath her eyes. "This dreadful business with Mr. Lomax has been very distressing for all of us," Clara said quietly as she poured. "The police keep asking questions, and people in the village look at us so oddly now." "I'm sure Inspector Slack is simply being thorough," Miss Marple replied. "These matters must be investigated properly, however unpleasant." Audrey sat at the small desk near the window, where she had apparently been working on the household accounts. The ledger lay open, showing columns of figures in a beautifully neat hand. Every entry was perfectly aligned, every sum correctly calculated. It spoke of a mind that valued order and precision above all else. "You keep excellent accounts, my dear," Miss Marple observed. "Such clear writing." "One must be accurate in these matters," Audrey replied. "A single error can throw everything into confusion." Miss Marple noticed that beside the ledger lay a small pot of glue and several strips of cloth. The ledger's binding had apparently been coming loose and required repair. "Mother taught us all to keep things in good order," Clara said. "We couldn't afford to replace things constantly, so we learned to mend and make do." There was a sound from upstairs, and Clara excused herself to attend to her mother. Audrey remained at her desk, bent over the columns of figures with complete concentration. Miss Marple took the opportunity to glance about the room more carefully. Through the doorway, she could see partway up the staircase. The cottage was small enough that the bedroom doors were visible from below. One door stood ajar, and through it Miss Marple could glimpse what appeared to be Beatrice's room. A hymn card was pinned to the wall beside the mirror, visible even from this distance. The familiar flat-topped letters of Beatrice's distinctive hand were clear. Presently Clara returned and offered to show Miss Marple upstairs to see what clothing and household items might be suitable for the jumble sale. They climbed the narrow stairs, passing the various bedroom doors. Diana's room was at the front of the cottage. The window stood open, and on the ledge Miss Marple noticed a streak of dried mud, the sort that might come from a bicycle. Tyre leaned against the wall outside. There was also a small snag of wool caught on a rough spot in the wooden frame. The wool was duck egg blue. "Diana is always leaving the window open," Clara said apologetically. "She likes the fresh air, and sometimes she goes out cycling so early that she climbs out rather than wake the household." "How enterprising," Miss Marple murmured. They examined various items that might be donated, and then descended the stairs once more. As they passed through the hall, Miss Marple noticed the coral bracelets on their tray. There were 3 now. She counted them carefully. 2 remained absent. "I wonder," Miss Marple said. "Might I trouble you for another glass of water? The stairs have left me rather breathless." "Of course. I'll fetch it from the scullery." The water is coldest there, but when Clara tried the scullery door, she found it locked. How odd. Mother must have locked it earlier. She does sometimes, to keep the jams and pickles secure when she's had tradesmen calling. The key should be in the parlor bowl. She went to fetch it, and Miss Marple observed that the key did indeed sit in a blue china bowl on the parlor sideboard, easily accessible to anyone in the household. "Mother is the only one who bothers with locking it," Clara explained as she opened the door. "The rest of us think it's rather unnecessary, but she insists it's a good habit." Miss Marple accepted her water and took the opportunity to glance into the scullery. The paste pot still sat on its shelf, but when she looked at it more closely, something seemed different from her previous visit. The surface of the paste appeared smoother, fresher, as though the top layer had been renewed. But when one looked at the level in the pot, there was a curious gap between the fresh paste at the top and the older, more settled paste at the bottom, as if someone had scooped out the middle portion and hastily replaced it to disguise the theft. After taking her leave and promising to send some items for the jumble sale, Miss Marple walked slowly back toward the village. Her mind was working rapidly, assembling the various pieces of evidence into a coherent picture. Diana's window, with its mud streak and its snag of blue wool. The girl clearly used that window for clandestine comings and goings, particularly early in the morning or late in the evening when she preferred not to be heard. The scullery that Mrs. Hale claimed to keep locked, yet whose key sat openly in the parlor bowl where any member of the household could take it. The paste pot with its telltale gap, showing where paste had been removed and the pot hastily refilled to hide the fact. Audrey's desk with its perfect columns and its pot of glue for mending ledgers. A practical use, certainly, but glue that could also be mixed with flour to create the sort of paste used to prepare the fatal rope. Beatrice's hymn card, with its distinctive lettering, the same hand that had annotated Lomax's sketch plan, and the coral bracelets. 3 on the tray, and 2, absent Ruth and Beatrice had claimed theirs, marking their intentions to marry and secure their portions. But the other 3 sisters had not yet taken that step. The deadline of Michaelmas loomed ever closer, now less than a week away. If 2 formal engagements were not established by then, the trust would fail, and Five Sisters Field would revert to the estate, where Mr. Lomax's employers could purchase it for their bypass. Everything pointed to a carefully orchestrated plan, executed with the sort of attention to detail That came from desperation combined with intelligence. But which sister had tied the fatal knot? Which one had possessed not just the means and opportunity, but the cold resolve to watch Mr. Lomax lean upon that rope, knowing it would fail? Miss Marple reached her own cottage and went inside. She sat down with her knitting, but her mind continued to work through the problem like fingers working through a particularly complex stitch pattern. The answer was there. She was certain of it. All the pieces lay before her like scattered beads from a broken necklace. She needed only to see how they threaded together to form the complete picture of what had happened at Miller's Well on that Thursday evening, where Mr. Lomax met his death. Chapter 9. The Secret the Five Kept. It was on a Sunday afternoon when the church bells had finished their ringing, and the village had settled into its customary post-service quietude, that Miss Marple found herself walking with Clara Hale along the lane that led past the old vicarage gardens. They had encountered one another after the service, and Clara had seemed grateful for the company. There was something troubled about the young woman, a heaviness that went beyond simple fatigue from her nursing duties. "Miss Marple," Clara said at length, "may I speak with you in confidence?" "Of course, my dear." They found a bench beneath an ancient oak, well away from any passing traffic. Clara sat with her hands folded in her lap, her gentle face showing the strain of some internal struggle. "I have been carrying a burden," she began slowly, "a secret that weighs upon me more with each passing day. And now, with Mr. Lomax's death and the police asking their questions, I find I cannot remain silent any longer." Miss Marple waited patiently, her expression encouraging but not pressing. "It concerns my father," Clara continued, "and the field, and why Mr. Lomax was so persistent in his attempts to acquire it." She drew a deep breath, as though steadying herself. "When Father was dying 3 years ago, he called us all to his bedside, Mother and all 5 of us daughters. He was in great distress, not from physical pain, but from something that troubled his conscience deeply." Miss Marple listened intently as the story unfolded. Mr. Hale, it seemed, had been a careful man, but not a wealthy one. Supporting a wife and 5 daughters on a clerk's salary had required constant economizing. When an opportunity arose to mortgage 5 sisters' fields secretly through a private arrangement, he had taken it, intending to pay back the sum gradually from small savings. But illness had prevented his working, and the debt remained. Worse, the mortgage paper had fallen into the hands of Mr. Lomax's employers, who saw an opportunity to acquire the land cheaply if the trust conditions failed to be met. "Father made us promise," Clara said quietly, "to keep the mortgage secret. He feared that if it became known, creditors might seize everything, leaving Mother and my sisters with nothing. He begged us to meet the trust terms, to have at least 2 of us properly engaged by Michaelmas, so that the field would vest in us, and we could eventually pay off the debt. And the bracelets, they were Father's gift, yes, but also a signal. We were to place them on the tray in the hall so that neighbors would see them and believe that all was well, that marriage portions were secure and the family's affairs in order. When a girl became engaged, she would take her bracelet and wear it, showing that another step toward securing our inheritance had been achieved." Miss Marple absorbed this information thoughtfully, but Mr. Lomax knew about the mortgage. Yes, he held the paper for his employers. He came to the cottage repeatedly, pressing Mother to sell the field before the trust could vest. He said it would be simpler, cleaner, that we would receive fair compensation. But we knew the compensation would barely cover the mortgage debt. We would lose both the field and Father's portions for us. He threatened exposure. Clara nodded miserably. He said if we did not cooperate, he would make the mortgage public. That would have destroyed us, Miss Marple. Mother would have been shamed, and any chance my sisters had of making respectable marriages would have been ruined. Who wants to marry into a family tainted by debt and deception? So, you and your sisters agreed to keep Mr. Lomax at bay until the trust deadline passed. We tried. Ruth and Beatrice both had understandings with decent men, and we hoped that formal engagements would be announced in time. But Mr. Lomax became more aggressive. He began paying particular attention to Audrey. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. What sort of attention? He suggested to her that if she would help, arrange for the trust to fail, perhaps by persuading Mother and the rest of us to give up. He could offer her compensation, in advance, money of her own, and other considerations. Clara's voice held distaste. Audrey refused him. Of course, but she was frightened that he would cause a scandal, that he would find some way to sabotage our plans. What happened on the evening Mr. Lomax died? Clara twisted her hands together. Diana insisted on meeting him. She said she would warn him off, make him understand that we would not be intimidated. She took a bucket with her, planning to fetch water from the well, so that if anyone saw her there, she could claim an innocent purpose. She went to Miller's Well deliberately. Yes, we all knew she was going. Mother was visiting Mrs. Clement, and the rest of us were occupied with our various tasks. Diana was to speak with Mr. Lomax firmly, to make him see reason. But something went wrong. Diana came home distraught. She said Mr. Lomax had been alive when she left him, that she had delivered her warning and departed. But she was frightened, Miss Marple. She said he had laughed at her, had told her the game was already won. Miss Marple sat very still, her mind racing through the implications. Did Diana see anyone else near the well? She said she thought she glimpsed someone in the distance near the ice-house stile, but she couldn't be certain. It was growing dusk, and she was upset. And the rope? Clara looked down at her hands. None of us knew about the rope until Inspector Slack came asking questions. Miss Marple, I swear to you that Diana did not harm Mr. Lomax. She is impulsive and brave, but she is not capable of cold-blooded murder. When she left him, he was alive and mocking her. Miss Marple considered the young woman beside her. Clara's distress was genuine, her desire to protect her family evident, but there were still pieces of the puzzle that did not fit properly together. Clara, who in your family knows about rope and whipping? Who would understand how to make a repair appear sound when it was not? We all know basic mending, Mother taught us. But for anything more complex, we would consult with someone who had practical experience, such as Tom Barkley, Ruth's young man. He works with ropes and harnesses constantly, or any of the farmers or workmen in the district. Why do you ask? Miss Marple did not answer directly. Instead, she asked, Has your mother been well these past days? She has seemed very tired. The strain has been considerable. They sat in silence for a moment. Then Miss Marple said gently, Clara, I think there are still things you do not know about what happened that evening, things that perhaps your family has kept even from you. Clara looked at her with frightened eyes. What do you mean? I mean that the truth is more complex than you realize, and I believe that very soon it will have to come out. They walked back toward the village. Together, but Miss Marple's mind was already arranging the final pieces of the puzzle. She knew now what had happened, and more importantly, she knew why. The secret the 5 daughters had kept was real. Enough, but it was not the whole story. There was another secret, darker and more dangerous, that someone at 5 Sisters' Cottage had been concealing with desperate determination. Chapter 10. Wellhead, Rope, Paste, and the Daughter Who Chose the Knot. The gathering at Miller's Well took place on a gray afternoon 3 days before. Michaelmas Inspector Slack had arranged it at Miss Marple's quiet suggestion, though he had done so with considerable reluctance, and no small amount of skepticism. Present were Mrs. Hale and her 5 daughters, along with Dr. Haydock, Mrs. Bantry, Canon Clement, and Inspector Slack himself, Missy. Marple stood near the wellhead, her slight figure somehow commanding attention despite her unassuming manner. Inspector Slack has asked me to explain certain observations, she began, her voice calm and steady. I shall endeavor to do so as clearly as possible. She gestured toward the well. The method used to cause Mr. Lomax's death was remarkably clever. The rope that hung across this well was deliberately sabotaged. It was sawn nearly through. Then the cut was concealed with a sleeve of paper and bookbinder's paste. Over this, a neat whipping of linen thread was wound. While dry, the rope appeared perfectly sound and would even support lightweight. But once moisture from the well's dampness penetrated the whipping and softened the paste, the paper sleeve would slip, and the rope would part cleanly under any significant strain. Mrs. Hale stood very still, her face pale. Beside her, the 5 daughters listened with varying expressions of shock and apprehension. It is an old trick, Miss Marple continued, sometimes used by dishonest farmers to make worn equipment appear serviceable until it can be sold. The technique requires patience, skill, and a thorough understanding of how rope behaves under different conditions. She paused, letting this sink in. The physical evidence is quite clear. Traces of paste containing flour, water, glue, and egg white were found at the scene. Linen thread matching that used in the whipping was discovered in the scullery at 5 Sisters Cottage, along with a paste pot showing signs of recent use. The middle portion had been scooped out and hastily replaced to disguise the theft. Inspector Slack stepped forward with the rope fragment in an evidence bag. But who prepared the rope? He asked, his voice gruff. That's what we need to establish. Miss Marple inclined her head. Indeed. Let us consider the evidence systematically. First, there is the matter of Mr. Lomax's sketch plan. It bore annotations in pencil written by someone other than Mr. Lomax himself. The handwriting showed a distinctive characteristic, flat-topped letters, particularly the letter D. This same formation appears in the hymn notations made by Beatrice Hale. Beatrice drew in a sharp breath, but said nothing. However, Miss Marple continued gently, Beatrice was at choir rehearsal throughout the crucial period. Multiple witnesses confirm this. She could not have been at the well when Mr. Lomax died. Then why did she annotate his plan? Slack demanded. I believe Mr. Lomax showed her the plan during one of his visits to the cottage, perhaps asking for local knowledge about landmarks. Beatrice, proud and protective of her family, made notes that might help her understand exactly what route the bypass would take. But her involvement ended there. Miss Marple turned her attention to the small group. Diana Hale was seen near the ice house stile wearing a duck-egg blue cardigan. Her footprint, distinctive because of a darned instep, was found near the well. Diana herself has admitted that she went to warn Mr. Lomax off, carrying a bucket as an excuse for being there. Diana's young face was streaked with tears. I didn't hurt him, she whispered. I swear it. I believe you, Miss Marple said with unexpected gentleness. You went to confront him directly, as is your nature. You're brave but impulsive. Diana, you would have struck him or pushed him, perhaps in a moment of anger, but you would not have contrived an elaborate mechanism requiring days of preparation. She let her gaze move across the assembled group. Mrs. Hale purchased linen, thread and bookbinder's paste from Mr. Pratt's shop. She had both means and knowledge, but Mrs. Hale was with Canon Clement's wife during the crucial time, and her character suggests she would have chosen a different course to protect her family. Mrs. Hale's eyes glistened with unshed tears, but she held her composure. That leaves us with Audrey, Miss Marple said quietly. The second daughter stood very straight, her pretty face drained of color. Her hands clasped at her waist showed white knuckles. Audrey keeps accounts, Miss Marple continued. She thinks in terms of columns and balance sheets. She purchased glue powder, ostensibly for ledger repair, which could easily be mixed with flour to create paste. She was alone at the cottage during the time when Mr. Lomax died, with no witnesses to her whereabouts. But she was at home, Ruth protested. She made tea for Mother. She had time to do both, Miss Marple replied. The well is but a 10-minute walk from the cottage. She could have slipped out, waited to ensure the rope failed as planned, and returned to her kettle and accounts. Inspector Slack was watching Audrey intently. Now, more significantly, Miss Marple went on, there is the question of motive and calculation. Mr. Lomax had approached Audrey specifically with his proposition. If she would help ensure the trust failed, he would compensate her privately. He may even have suggested other inducements as men of his character want to do. Audrey's lips trembled, but she remained silent. Audrey refused him, but she also understood something the others did not fully grasp. She is the one who manages the household finances. She knew exactly how precarious the family's position was. She saw that Diana's impulsive confrontation might provoke Mr. Lomax to immediate action to expose the mortgage and ruin them all before Michaelmas could arrive. Miss Marple's voice was very gentle now, so Audrey, with her neat mind and her understanding of how things must balance, decided to make Mr. Lomax disappear from the equation entirely. She prepared the rope using the scullery paste and linen thread. She did it carefully, methodically, as she does everything. She may have learned the technique from Tom Barkley, Ruth's young man, perhaps asking innocent questions about rope repair that he answered without suspecting her purpose. The note found in Mr. Lomax's motor car showed the calculation. $500 to 1,002 dowries, 2 engagements needed by Michaelmas, and below that a reminder about bracelets being returned to the tray. Audrey was thinking through every detail, planning how to stage the scene. Audrey stood frozen, her gray eyes wide. She knew Diana planned to meet Lomax at the well. She sent her sister there with a bucket, ensuring the rope would be dampened at the right time. She herself went by a different route, wearing a blue cardigan under her coat, and waited near the ice house stile to watch when Mr. Lomax leaned upon the rope to pull the bucket or peer into the well. It gave way exactly, as she had calculated it would. Then she returned home, swiftly removed the cardigan, and sat down at her ledger as though she'd never left. When her mother returned, Audrey had tea ready and accounts properly balanced. The silence that followed was profound. Then Audrey spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. Would have destroyed us all. Everything Father tried to secure for us. Everything Mother sacrificed to maintain. I looked at the figures, Miss Marple. I looked at them over and over. There was no way to make it balance, except to remove him from the calculation. She touched the coral bracelet to her wrist with trembling fingers. I made it balance, she said. That's what I do. I make things add up properly. Miss Marple's expression held profound sadness. Ledgers do balance, my dear, until one writes red entries in them that cannot be erased. Rope and paste will hold for a time. So will secrets, but both come apart when enough pressure is applied. Inspector Slack moved forward, and Audrey did not resist as he took her gently by the arm. Diana burst into tears. Beatrice turned away, her jaw set hard against emotion. Ruth took her mother's hand. Clara, poor Clara, crossed to her sister and fastened the coral bracelet more securely on Audrey's wrist, as though that small gesture might somehow help. Mrs. Hale spoke, her voice breaking. She did it for all of us, to protect the family. I know, Miss Marple said softly. But protection purchased at such a price exacts its own terrible cost. Later, As Miss Marple walked back to the village with Mrs. Bantry, her friend remarked, "You knew it was Audrey all along, didn't you?" I suspected. The careful planning, the understanding of accounts and balance, the ability to see people as figures in a ledger rather than as human beings. It is a dangerous trait when combined with desperation. She paused at her garden gate. Families are like whippings around a rope. Dolly, they work best when made of honest thread laid firm, not paste and deception hiding a cut beneath. Mrs. Bantry nodded slowly, understanding the melancholy wisdom in her friend's words. Miss Marple went inside to her familiar sitting room, where her knitting awaited in its basket. But for a long time she simply sat by the window, looking out at the peaceful village and thinking about 5 sisters and the terrible price one had paid to protect them.